In 2018, out of all the amazing AAA titles to release, Red Dead Redemption 2 was the clear standout. After buying it at launch, I proceeded to not only beat it within the next few days, but have one of the most immersive gaming experiences I can remember. Red Dead 2 sits high among one of the few games to truly immerse me inside the world itself, and even today I wonder how a game could do such an amazing thing. This year though, about 4 years after the release of Red Dead 2, I went back to replay through the first game. I ended up buckling down to play this game for two separate reasons. First of all, I was interested in the story, due to being bombarded with Red Dead Redemption YouTube shorts. The second thing to entice me was my revisit of GTA 5's campaign. Long story short, I did my monthly revisit of GTA Online, but because NPC crowd density and AI is worse in online, I decided to load up the single player. This then prompted me to play through my favorite missions, which reminded me of how much I love Rockstar Games writing. And then boom, I decided to buckle down and play through Red Dead Redemption 1. After finishing Red Dead 1's campaign though, I was not only satisfied with the story, but also intrigued by one particular thing the game does. In this game, Rockstar explores a parallel story structure, where the player has to go through a story where there's two opposing sides of a conflict fighting each other, with the player stuck in the middle. As I pondered this, I realized that Red Dead 2 does a similar thing in its third chapter. Red Dead 1 explores the 1910 Mexican Revolution, and the sequel similarly explores the feud between two old plantation families. So for the majority of this video, I wanted to analyze how these games pull off this aspect of storytelling, and even connect it to Rockstar's overall game design. As you can see, the point of this video is a lot more specific than a review, and thus I'll avoid overbearing criticisms till the end. But anyways, let's go through these games one by one, starting with the parallel story structure in Red Dead Redemption 1. Okay, so some pretext for the first Red Dead Redemption game is that it takes place in 1911 Western America, a time where the western frontier was finally being tamed and regulated by the federal government. In the second act of the game, you're sent south to Mexico to search for Bill Williamson and Javier Escuela, two bandits who used to be in the Dutch Vanderlyn gang. You play of course as John Marston, who doesn't morally agree with the government, especially considering the fact that he was in the same exact gang as Bill and Javier, but because the men he's hunting are legitimate menaces to Western society and the government is holding his family hostage, he agrees to capture Bill and Javier. Currently though, there's a revolution in Mexico. I'm not sure if this is the 1910 Mexican Revolution or if it's just inspired by it, but all you have to know is that there's a revolution going on. On one side is the large and powerful Mexican army, represented by men like Vincent de Santa and his superior Agustin Allende. On the other side there's the rebels, with people like Abraham Reyes and the surprisingly important Luisa Fortuna. So boom, there's a war going on and there's two sides involved. That's the basic parallel structure I'll be discussing, because John Marston at least partially helps out both sides of this conflict, and both promise to give him information leading to Javier and Bill if he helps them with their cause. So that's the initial catalyst, but the game dips into something a little more interesting, which is morality. Many other game developers would simply make one side good, the other bad, and then make the player end up siding with the good guys. Rockstar realized that if they wanted to make this parallel structure actually interesting though, each side needs to have their own individual list of pros and cons. Even though yes, of course you'll end up helping the rebels overcome the government at the end, both sides do at some point have some merit, especially in the eyes of the player character John Marston. To accomplish this, they do one very important thing at the start, which is making you work for the government first. This affiliates the player with their side of the conflict. Even though the government definitely seems corrupt and nationalistic, the thought of wanting to crush ruthless rebels isn't really too out of pocket. To convey this, the player is given many missions in which they're really just defending government property. For instance, a train. In fact, there's actually 2 missions in which you have to protect a train from the rebels. But then all of a sudden, some cracks begin to form. You're given a mission in which not only you have to burn down a rebel village, but you have to capture women and give them to Agustin Allende as sex slaves. The abuse of women on the government side is very prominent actually, and at the start of many missions, you're shown some big-wig military guy chasing women around. Keep this point in mind for later. Anyways, John Marston and thus the player are basically looking past this behavior because at the end of the day, this is what you need to do to catch Bill and Javier. But eventually, after being strawed on by the government for so long, you end up going to the rebels, because they too may be able to help you catch Bill and Javier, and thus get you a little bit closer to being able to reunite with your family. In fact, the rebels might be able to help you reach your target even faster because they're actually rumored to be close with the people that you're trying to catch. Anyways, immediately on the rebel side, you're presented with Luisa Fortuna. This is a very passionate rebel that displays everything you'd expect from that sort of nationalistic revolutionary type. She's likely the least corrupt person that you meet throughout this entire conflict, and she's willing to fight to the death for her country. But ThyDashMan, I hear you asking, isn't this conflict morally interesting? Aren't there pros and cons for each side? Well yeah, that's where Abraham Reyes comes in. Reyes is initially described to Marston as one of those ideal freedom fighters. He's a big leader for the revolutionaries. He's the type of person to get folk songs made after him to be passed down and shared for years to come. In fact, before you meet him for the very first time, he's described by Luisa. She says that she loves him, and that they're basically married already. Then you actually get to meet him, and when you ask about Luisa, he actually has trouble remembering who she is. Throughout the entire game, he messes up her name, even after she dies in an attempt to save him. As you fight with the rebels, you're shown through Louisa that their cause is morally good, but through Reyes, you're presented with yet another egotistical narcissist who's obviously only hoping the revolution is successful because that will give him even more power. Oh, and remember when I told you to take note about how the military takes advantage of women? Something really funny is that Abraham Reyes consistently does this as well. Throughout the entire campaign, Reyes is often taking advantage of women. It really paints him as being no different than the government. The military officers use their physical raw power to force women to do what they want, yet Reyes uses the power of his popularity to take advantage of women. At the end of the day, of course, they're both very unjustified in doing this, and I think does a really good job at showing how they're not so different. Anyways, once the Mexican army figures out that Marston is helping the rebels to some extent, they decide to set up a trap and kill him. The rebels luckily are able to save Marston moments before death, and because the army attempted to assassinate him, Marston ultimately decides to side with the rebels. With the rebels' help, he's able to kill DeSanta, Allende, Bill Williamson, and you're able to choose whether you spare or kill Javier. Either way though, he's doomed to a terrible existence, so it doesn't really matter. Oh yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, Louisa dies in an attempt to save Reyes. So boom, here are all the people that are involved in the conflict, and here are all the people that come out alive. Of course, morally speaking, this is not the best outcome, but narratively speaking, it definitely is. You see, if all the bad guys died along with Reyes and Louisa becomes a victor and the new leader of Mexico, then the whole attempt at moral ambiguity is fruitless. But this way, not all of the bad guys lose, and not all of the bad guys win. With Louisa dying and Reyes becoming crowned as the new leader, the players meant to think to themselves if this will be any better than how it was before. Sure, the revolutionaries win, and Reyes says he's running the country for the sake of the people, but Reyes will continue to chase women behind closed doors, similar to how the nationalistic government did before him. Reyes has in no way proved himself to be anything but a big-mouth narcissist buffoon, and it almost feels like in a few years, yet another revolution will form, but against Reyes. After this segment though, both Bill and Javier are captured or dead, and so Marston leaves Mexico to continue up with the main story in the United States. So I mentioned at the start of this video that the parallel structure and dual narrative in both Red Dead games show the best and worst of Rockstar's game design structure. The good in Red Dead 1 is of course the very complex and detailed characters. The story has the perfect amount of moral ambiguity to make you think a bit, but it's still pretty easy to catch on to. But sadly, there are some cons, and I think the big cons for this section is everything from mission structure to overall pacing. Marston kills hundreds of rebels, yet they accept him as one of their own so easily. Also, something that's sort of a problem is that in this section of the game, there isn't that much of that amazing Rockstar chemistry that I love. For example, in the last third of the game, the part after this section, Marston finally gets to interact with his wife, his son, and his old gang leader, Dutch. The chemistry in these scenes is so strong and so much more captivating than any part of the Mexico section. In fact, when I went to replay through GTA 5, as I mentioned earlier, the big thing that caught me were some of these small moments between characters. In the second mission where Michael and Franklin interact with each other, there's this really great monologue with Michael sitting on this chair. These are the moments that I think make these stories so interesting to me. Yet in Red Dead 1, the only reason why the player is interacting with the Mexican Revolution is because helping the sides will lead him to being able to continue with the main quest of the game. It's this huge side quest in which people are just using you. At the end of the day, you're only doing this for information and to eventually get to Bill and Javier. It's not an actual story that you're really taking a part in. Not to mention, again, there's no real good chemistry between John Marston and any other main character. This is again fixed in the later section with Dutch and your wife and son, but yeah, it sort of makes this section a little dry. But luckily, Red Dead 2 solves this very well. Despite the dual narrative structure, they allow for this great chemistry to run its course underneath. In fact, in many cases, Red Dead 2's dual narrative splits into a 3 and even technically 4-way narrative. As I'll explain in the next section though, this leads to a ton of its own problems as well. Red Dead Redemption 2 is the prequel to Red Dead 1 and has the player, now Arthur Morgan, experience the decline of the Van der Linde gang of which Arthur is a member. Red Dead Redemption 1 only introduces 7 members of the gang, yet Red Dead 2 almost triples that number. As the game goes on, the player is shown the decline of this once great gang. And of course this leads to Red Dead 1 where John Marston has to kill the remaining members. The dual narrative structure presented in Red Dead 2 is far more complicated than 1, primarily because in 2 you not only have perspectives from 2 sides of the conflict, but as I mentioned earlier, there's even more sides, and those additional perspectives are the Van der Linde gang itself. To start though, let me describe what got the Van der Linde gang into this dual narrative position. After the failure of the Blackwater heist, the Van der Linde gang goes into hiding. Eventually they make their way out of hiding though, and travel into the Heartlands near the town of Valentine. Then, after an escalation of events in Valentine, Moonshine, the gang moves south into the land of Lemoyne, with the great town of Rhodes in the center. Might I quickly add, by the way, that one of my favorite parts of Red Dead 2 is how interesting and unique the different towns and cities are. In Red Dead 1, the land is practically entirely desert in Western stereotypes. But, in Red Dead 2, the green grassy heartland sparks a great contrast between the red dirt of Rhodes and the polluted grays of Saint Denis. In Rhodes, the gang is trying to hide from the law, yet it's still focused on getting money, which they view as the key to solving their problems with the government. This issue again leads to Red Dead 1, and honestly the way that these two games interact with each other might be the most seamless and perfect transition any game series has ever had. Rhodes is home to two large plantation families, the Greys and Braithwaites. The Greys are an old plantation family that's heavily integrated into the law and sheriff's office, and is just generally invested heavily into the town of Rhodes. The Braithwaites, though, are involved into more illegal activities, like the production of moonshine. Even though the Grey sheriffs are not shown to be entirely moral or responsible, they're still definitely on the right side of the law, especially compared to the Braithwaites. Both families farm cotton and tobacco, and are pretty wealthy. Now the dual structure begins to form once it's described that these two families have been at war with each other for quite some time. Specifically, there's rumors to be lost gold treasure that each family is rumored to have in their possession, and of course the Vanderlyn gang really wants to steal that money. Okay, so very quickly I want to describe how this whole setup is not done that well, and specifically it's not done nearly as good as the first game. Okay, so the first reason is that, well, in Red Dead 1, the conflict is set up in actual missions. You do jobs for each side before being shown the entirety of the conflict. This lets the player really figure it out for themselves. If you've played any Rockstar game, then you've definitely noticed that they chalk the hours of horse or car travel with tons of dialogue. In games like Red Dead 1 and GTA 5, the travel dialogue takes a very clear backseat. As I described a second ago, the actual missions described the conflict at hand. In Red Dead 2 though, so much of the exposition is exposed through the horse riding dialogue. In just one of the first missions at Rhodes, after helping out the sheriff, they basically spell out the entire conflict for you. Now the following missions are actually pretty good. You help out the Braithwaites with their moonshine operation, you steal some of the Greys' horses, you help out the Greys in sheriff work, and you even participate in this Romeo and Juliet-like story. Really quickly, let me just explain this one weird story inconsistently. I don't really know what to think about. Okay, so using Romeo and Juliet stand-ins for the family to describe the feud is sort of cliche, and it made me think that Rockstar was trying to treat the player like a baby. It's almost like they're making the story as obvious as possible. But then again, there's moments like when Arthur jokes about how cliche it is. They directly compare it to Romeo and Juliet in the game itself. Not to mention, they also use it for some interesting missions, like this one revolving around female suffrage. I think that if the storyline was maybe developed a little bit more in terms of how it affected the main story, I'd enjoy it more, but how it is now, with its sort of side content-like feel, I don't consider it to be the best addition to the story. But really quickly, I want to remind you about how well the sexualization of women is used in Red Dead 1 to show how each side is similarly morally corrupt. In my opinion, that's a much better way to show moral ambiguity than a spin-off Romeo and Juliet. But I'll save the rest of my comparisons for later in the video. Now before I describe the outcome of this conflict, I want to quickly describe the third-party involvement of the Vanderlyn gang itself, and more importantly, how it absolutely carries this entire segment of the game, and the entire game in general. As I mentioned in the Red Dead 1 part of this video, the most powerful story segments of that game came from the involvement of John Marston's family and Dutch Vanderlyn. There were moments where characters like Javier and Bill had similar chemistry with John, but for the most part it was just a screaming match between men set out to kill each other. In Red Dead 2 though, the entire game consists of the gang itself, and so you're literally always given those amazing character interactions that work so well in Rockstar games. When I revisited GTA 5 story, the thing again that prompted me to play through Red Dead 1 and make this video in general, the biggest draw for me was those small character moments between characters that I love so much. Again, that monologue by Michael when he's talking to Franklin and these similar conversations that they have in the car. It instantly got me intrigued in the characters and their motivations. Also, an interesting thing is because I knew how the game ended, I could really see the big picture character development that they were going for. In Red Dead 2, the Vanderlyn gang is divided by people like Arthur and his side of the gang that are trying to make things out as peacefully as possible, but understand that violence is needed to survive. Yet there's other people in the gang like Micah Bell who want things to go out well for the gang just like the others, but are more subject to violent tendencies because they believe the world they live in calls for that type of action. Other gangs in the game itself, like the O'Driscolls, provide a background to show that Micah and his beliefs may be opposed to Arthur's, but they're not nearly as violent as other gangs. So this third party makes every small moment and hill on the journey of Red Dead 2 so impactful because it gives so much contextualization for the eventual eruption of morality and emotions at the end of the game. Oh boy, I just got sidetracked with how amazing the game is, but anyways, let's go back to the dual narrative structure itself. Okay, so again, there's two main opposing sides of the conflict, the Braithwaites and the Greys. These are intercepted by the Vanderlyn gang that tries to rob and cheat both families. The gang itself is divided by people who want to go along with these devious plans and others who question if it's worth the risk. In the story though, things quickly come to an end as after helping both families as described before, they simply turn on you and discover your plan to fool them, and thus you now have to fight each family head on. The Grey fight goes poorly as a member of the gang, Sean, dies. You're able to make it out though with time to flee the county. The Braithwaites put up a good fight but poked the hornet's nest by kidnapping Jack Marston, John Marston's son, and the future epilogue protagonist of Red Dead Redemption 1. Oh my gosh, I love this story so much. And despite the decent two-way story setup, the climax resolves both arguments between two missions. It very clearly sets up the next chapter where the gang goes to Saint Denis, and the climax is very quick and I'd even say rushed. But considering the fact that this part of the story is sort of the middle point, I understand why it's done this way. I mean hell, this entire part of the game is only 1/8 of the main story, yet the Mexico segment of Red Dead 1 is probably a whopping 1/3. Again, I understand that this is one of many hills that are crossed in the game, but I still think there's so much more that could have been done for the ending. It just resolves itself too quickly. Similar to Red Dead 1, I want to quickly describe just what this narrative structure tells me about Rockstar Games itself. Now, as I described earlier, using the Vanderlyn gang in the middle part of this dual narrative rules because you get to be in the presence of some of the best characters, writing, and chemistry in all of gaming. At the end of this one mundane mission, you're literally given the option to go fishing with Dutch and Hosea. The fact that I instantly said yes and enjoyed 20 minutes of dialogue between these amazing characters proves that the writing and chemistry Rockstar is able to create is just next level. Sadly though, because this part is so awesome, everything else seems to sort of crumble beneath it. The actual evolving narrative of the gang versus the world becomes a bit sloppy and falls into the background. Even though I do prefer Red Dead 2 over 1, its pacing and parallel structure in this segment I've been describing ends up being a bit underdeveloped. The two main sides of the dual narrative, the Greys and the Braithwaites, are definitely interesting and detailed enough to serve as a good part of the story, but because a lot of the focus is on the gang itself, it felt like they were given a lot less screen time compared to, let's say, the Revolution in Red Dead 1. Anyways, to describe why I think the dual narrative structure itself in Red Dead 2 is much more boring than Red Dead 1, I need to compare them more directly. And so that leads to the next part of this video where I compare the dual narrative structure of these two games. So individually, both of these games do succeed in many particular aspects of dual narrative structure. Red Dead 1 presents the conflict in such an amazing way. The pacing and development of the Mexican Revolution is a substantial achievement and provides a definite example of how to make a dual narrative structure both narratively and morally interesting. Despite this though, the segment fails at one big thing, and that's tying the narrative to the overarching story. The narrative definitely feels more like a detour. John Marston is only interacting with these people so he can get back to his family. On the other hand, I think that Red Dead 2 definitely blends its parallel structure segment with the main narrative in a much more clear and precise way. Even though some later parts of the game are sort of frustrating and take too long, this conflict and action itself is pretty satisfying. Sadly though, the dual narrative itself is much more lackluster, unlike Red Dead 1. The feud between the two families and the complexities within it never get nearly as close and amazing as how it's done in Red Dead 1. Again, one uses a ripoff of Romeo and Juliet, and the other has multiple tyrannical leaders all using different types of power to support similar evils. I don't think it's hard to judge which is better in these regards. The fact that the story and game have to focus on so many different perspectives and aspects just hurt itself at the end. Okay, so Red Dead 1 has a good narrative that fits into the game badly, yet Red Dead 2 has a worse dual narrative but fits inside the game much better. The reason why I've been focusing on the individual dual narratives, by the way, is because of how interesting of a concept I think it is. It allows for moral complications and an interesting narrative experience that honestly only video games have the ability to do well. Not to mention, being in the middle of a huge conflict is a great way to set up some interesting game design and missions. Another game I can think of that does this sort of thing is Last of Us Part 2. Similarly, you explore two sides of a conflict, one side being Ellie and one side being Abby. I have not played this game yet, but it's really high on my list of games I'm planning to get to. Once I beat it, I may even make a follow-up video to this one, where I discuss the dual narrative in that game. I do hope that I've been sort of able to interest you guys in this sort of story analysis, because I sure as hell have been interested in this topic, as you can tell. As gamers, we can definitely learn from these games, and most importantly, I think it's important to see what works and what doesn't work for these games. So hopefully in future games you can catch these things and start to analyze it yourself. Red Dead 2 and 1 are very much so worth visiting. revisiting. It's probably the best story that Rockstar has put out that I've played, and I also personally really love cowboys. But now I sort of want to go off topic for a bit. I'm still going to be talking about Red Dead Redemption, but instead of analyzing the stories, I want to talk about other things that the games do. There's a few specific things I want to talk about, and then after, I'll talk about this channel in general. If I ever get one of my friends to play through GTA 5 who have been nagging to play it for years at this point, I'm definitely gonna load it up and replay through a ton of those missions. Oh yeah, quick side note, Rockstar does an amazing job at letting you replay through individual missions in the recent games. GTA 5 and Red Dead Redemption 2 have this feature. It's really easy to go right back into them, and if it wasn't for that, I may have not replayed through parts of Red Dead 2 for this video. Also, just in general, I think that despite having fairly average gameplay and insanely detailed open worlds, the story, writing, and characters of games Rockstar makes is what makes me want to go back and play their games over and over again. The whole reason why I wanted to make this video was because of how well they did the narratives in the Red Dead Redemption games, specifically with the dual narratives that I analyzed. But there's so much more to these games and their narratives that are definitely worth checking out. And even though I did spoil some things, there's definitely a lot more to explore if you haven't played them. Some similar story-based games, if you want to analyze and have these epiphanies that I had, are things like GTA and Red Dead 2, but also games from developers like Naughty Dog, a bunch of those PlayStation exclusives, and more specifically, I definitely recommend games like Half-Life and BioShock. But now, let me switch to defending a viewpoint that I have that I feel has become increasingly uncommon. If you're watching this channel to begin with, you likely have seen the prolific Red Dead Redemption 2 video by NakeyJakey. Despite many of his points being pretty fair and reasonable, there's a few things that I disagree with. For context, in the video, Jakey attempts to break down why Red Dead Redemption 2, despite being a very fun and good game, has many problems that describe the downfall that Rockstar Games' mission design has gone through. You see, there's big open-ended open world sections, and then there's extremely linear and repetitive story missions. Even though I do slightly agree with him, after playing through Red Dead 1 and then 2, I was honestly much happier with the way that Rockstar designs the missions in recent games. Okay, so in Red Dead 2, every mission usually starts off as a fairly mundane event. It's not meant to have action. In almost every mission, it doesn't feel like a big shootout is planned, but eventually things are construed and turn into a troublesome event that the player has to find their way around. Even though it is sort of repetitive, it does involve some thinking, and every mission brought something new that I wasn't expecting. Red Dead 1, on the other hand, almost always opens up missions by telling the player, I want you to go over here and shoot these people. Compared to Red Dead 1, I think 2 mixes up the mission structure and narrative a lot better. Both games do have a strict linear nature, but in 2, every shooting gallery feels at least a little more interesting than in 1. More importantly, it makes the story and narrative much more complex, as violence is usually just a means to settle a dispute that's conjured up some other ways. Violence is not the entire focus of Red Dead 2, but in 1 it's a lot bigger of a focus. Thus, I disagree with Jakey's statement in his video. Also, I think that it's great that Rockstar realized that the best parts of Red Dead Redemption 1 were the interactions with Dutch, and thus they basically designed an entire game around that. Even though aspects like length and sometimes repetitive gameplay can be brought into account, not only are those not the focus of this video, but the story and characters alone brought this game to be one of the most enjoyable gaming experiences I've ever had. Okay, so this is the end of the video. Thank you guys so much for watching this. I had such a fun time playing through these games again, and I really do recommend them to you guys because they're such good experiences. So also thank you guys for watching this video. The last video that I put out I consider to be some of my best work, so please check those out as well. And this summer I've been playing through quite a few games, and I have a lot to talk about in the future, so I have a few more projects planned. And with school starting up soon, I'm not sure when I'll be able to get to them, but hopefully I'll be able to get to them soon. Also, I'm very proud of how this video turned out, honestly. Like, this is one of the best things I've made in my opinion, and I'm so happy I was able to get this idea that was in my head for such a long time and actually create it. Also, more importantly, I'm very happy I'm able to extend outward from simple reviews, and as you can tell, this is much more of an analysis project than anything else. In fact, I actually have one more important project that I want to put out. I mentioned this in the last video, I think, but I'm not so sure when I'm even going to be ready to start covering that, but it's very important to me, so I'm really happy to, and I'm looking forward to the future. Thank you guys so much for watching this. Please like, subscribe, and most importantly, recommend this channel to your friends if you think they'd like it, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Ring, ring, ring. Ring, ring, ring. Ring, ring, ring. Telephone.